Hi and welcome to this video in which we're going to look at exporting data from QPSMR Companion so that you can use it in other software. There is another use as well where you might want to export the data to Excel so you can make changes in Excel to the data or add some more data and bring it back in to QPS. We're going to start by looking at some of the more simple exercises that you can carry out exporting data. And we're going to start with going to the File menu and looking at how you export to SSS and SPSS. So if we click on this here, we have a project here that's got about 800 records. We can just click on the SSS link here, open the data file. If you haven't got the data file present there, you can browse for it and select it. I've already got it selected, so I've just got to click on the Open file and choose a QDF that you want to export to, and it's already done it. So that's now done an export to SSS. SSS is a good export to use. It's very safe. It's a system that's a standard that's supported by about 50 to 60 software packages around the world, and it should mean that you can just send these two files here, the XML file that's been exported and the ASCII file, and that should be able to be imported into another piece of software that supports the SSS standard, and your project will be ready to use with the data and of course also the text. So if we look at the XML file, for those familiar with an XML file, it is a representation of all the text and the variables within this project that can then be read in by another piece of software. And of course, QPS has the ability to read in a file of this type, and we could indeed import this back in from this export. All right, so that's the first export we've looked at. We're now going to look at an SPSS export, and that's the same process, except we choose this option. We open the data file, and we'll call it SPSS this time. Save it, and again we get confirmation messages, and you'll see now that it's made a file called data exported SPSS.sps and an ASCII data file, rather like the export that it made from SSS, but of course in a different format. Now if you want to get that into an SPSS SAB file, which is the other form of storing SPSS data, so everything's in one file, you can just open up your SPSS license. You of course will need an SPSS license to do this. Highlight all of the rows, select all, and then just click the run button here, and that should point it at the data file and open up the data for you. And if we go to the SPSS window, we should be able to find the data all present. So that's the same project now in SPSS. There's all the variables. It would have split any multi-response questions. So this question 9 here was a multi-response, so it split that across 6 fields. And the data can be viewed here, similar to what you can do in QPS. So that's an export to SPSS. And now let's look at some other exports that we can do. Now, we can also export our data to a spreadsheet, and once it's in a spreadsheet we could edit that and pull it back in to QPS, so we can output our data, add data or change data and then read it back in. So we're just going to look at the exporting part of that process now. So we go into the data menu again, but data menu this time. We click export data this time, so we click on export data. And it looks pretty similar to before. Again, I could browse for the data, or if I've already got it selected, open the data file. And it tells me down here I've got 831 entries. And this is much more like a wizard. Now, note this little item here, load and export details file. An export details file is something that you can save so that next time that you run it, it will save everything. So if we were, for example, only to export a small number of the variables, maybe just 10 variables here rather than the whole project, we could save that as we go through this process, so that when we went back to this project at a later date, we could just load those export data back in from a file that we've saved, and it would mean we wouldn't have to go through the whole steps of choosing which variables we were outputting a second time. So we can go through this wizard and we click the next button, and we have an option here to either use all the 831 records in the project, or we can click on the selected records button, and here you can start to do filter definitions just like you do filter definitions in the main QPS part of the program. So if I wanted to only pick people who were region number 1, I could type that in, or I could do that through a menu system in test, just like defining filters. If I don't put anything there, or I leave it as all records in the data file, it's going to output everything for me rather than just selected records. So I'm going to leave that on this occasion rather than select particular records. Click next, and you can see there's different choices here. So if I want an output file in Excel, I can make a readable output file. If I want a portable file for QPS, so that I can perhaps add in open-ended data or change some data and load it back in, I could put it in, choose that option. And I have the option to do it as a CSV file rather than an Excel file. If I don't actually want to use Microsoft Excel, there's other programs that can open up a CSV file for me. There's an option here to include the question text as a row in the table, so you get a header effectively. And then down here, you can choose which variables you're going to export. So here we have a list of things like the serial number, the questions, the ZZ entries. So the default is that it doesn't export the ZZ entries. It's unlikely you'd want those, but if you did, you can check that box and they would be exported as well. You could choose whether to export variables as well as questions, so that's probably something you generally do want. Filters you might not want. You might decide that you don't want filters, and the whole filters likewise you might want to keep or remove those. And then once you go to all these different types that you've selected, you can go into a little bit more detail. So the questions, for example, you could say, well, I want all of the questions, but I don't actually want verbatim questions, date and time questions, and I don't want character questions, but I want the other types, and just leave those 4 selected, so it would remove the other types of questions. With variables, we could remove any types here, and so on. And responses, we could remove various types of responses and any empty ones. And on multis, there's different ways of storing that, either as one column that's separated by a semicolon, for example. So if there's a multiple response question, you could output that as 1 semicolon 2 3 if somebody had answer 1 2 and 3. There are some binary formats which are rarely used these days, which you could use, or you can use more than 1 column for entry, so that they're named with an underscore 1 2 3 4, rather like we saw in SPSS just now. And we could give every response its own column if we want to as well, rather than packing it into the minimum number of columns. So there's some options there that we can use. If you don't want any of those, there is one here for values as well, to store values in different ways, which you can also set. So if you don't want any of those options, or I just changed a couple of options there, I removed these types of questions, we can go next onto the next step of the filter, and then we can choose whether we use all the variables or just some of them. So if we have this highlighted as all relevant entries in the project, it will just export everything, but of course taking on board the selections that we made on the previous window, which we can go back to if we want to with the previous button here. But if we only want certain entries, we can click on this button, and over here we can just select some of the entries. So I could just select that bunch of entries there, and now you see I've only got the entries that are highlighted in the window over here, and if I wanted to from that, I could select various variables from this, but I've just got this bunch of variables, and now I'm ready to finish and actually carry out the export. I could save these details so that everything was saved, because perhaps if the data was rerun with changes or to correct errors, or more data was added, I might want to conduct exactly the same export the next time or for the next wave of the data. So if that's the case, it's a good idea to save those details. And you remember at the beginning I pointed out the load details, so you could just load them back in having saved them. So there's an option there to name this as a details file and load it back in, so that you don't have to go through all these selection steps again, and more to the point, don't forget anything that you want on a particular export that you're doing. Over here is an interesting button, so I'm going to select just some of these here. I'm going to just select that block of variables from this list, just the ones in the middle here. Over here I have the choice to output my selections that I've made here as text or as codes. If I leave that checkbox there, I'm going to get these coming out as texts. If I turn it off, the region would come out as 1, 2 and 3, whereas with text it will come out as north, central and south. Let's click finish. It's now looking for a file name for my Excel workbook, and it'll actually automatically open that for you at the end. And you can see now I've got the text down here coming out for north, and probably further down we'll find some that are for the other regions in the data, central and so on. So that's exported my data as text, so that I can now analyze that, possibly using pivot tables in Excel, or transferring it to another system if another system can read in text. If I wanted codes there, I could have output codes, so that rather than north here, I would have got 1, 2, 3. So that completes this video on exporting data from the QPSMR Companion. We've looked at the different types of SSS, SPSS, and looking at selective outputs. There is just a couple more exports that follow the same procedure here. If you want to export to MRDCL to get an MRDCL script, you can just export a CL script there as an STP file. So that's an option that you have that will put your project into MRDCL, so that you can use the more advanced facilities that are available to people who have an MRDCL license. Similarly, if you have a Quantum license, you might want to export the project to Quantum. So there's a few options here that you have to export your project to other systems and make use of them with other software. SSS is the most common one to use as interchange format to a wide number of different software packages, but we've looked at some options here that should be able to help you move a project from one piece of software to another. Thank you for watching this video.